Okay, let's unpack this. For decades, if you heard the term Mau Mau, it was usually preceded by words like terrorist, savage, or rebellion.
And that was entirely by design. That was the outside colonial narrative crafted explicitly to justify brutal and often excessive repression.
So right off the bat, we have to move past that label.
We must. What's fascinating here is that the first step is to recognize the movement by its own name, a name that perfectly encapsulates their dual goals: the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, or KLFA.
Land and freedom.
Exactly. They understood precisely what they were fighting for, and that was the name they chose for themselves. The term Mau Mau was, well, it was imposed on them.
Our mission in this deep dive is to reclaim that narrative. We're going to be using one extraordinary document, an insider account from a freedom fighter named Karari Njama, to shatter that colonial propaganda.
She's the only way to do it.
Yeah. We're moving beyond the official history, the British version of events, and getting the true insider's view of the motivation, the meticulous structure, the political fracturing, and ultimately the devastating aftermath of this whole anti-imperialist struggle.
And that internal perspective is not just helpful, it's absolutely vital. The core of our source material is this extensive autobiographical story told by Karari Njama to Donald L. Barnett. It was first published as Mau Mau from Within, an analysis of Kenya's peasant revolt.
And Barnett, who was he?
He was an American anthropologist, but one with a background in assisting liberation movements. He conducted his primary research around 1960 and 1961, so right after the state of emergency had officially been declared over by the British.
So this is history documented almost in real time. It's not someone looking back 50 years later. It's a participant, a survivor, with the skills to communicate what he went through. It sounds like an intentional act of historical counterinsurgency.
It was, absolutely. The book was conceived as an intentional contesting narrative. The goal was to counter the outsiders, the colonial partisans with hostile agendas whose entire purpose was the distortion, dismissal, vilification, and demonization of the liberation war.
So this account is trying to restore what they call the heroic role of the Kenyan masses in the fight for their motherland.
Precisely. To make sure that the history books didn't just contain the sanitized version that was approved by Whitehall.
Okay, so let's delve into the source itself, because the foundation of this knowledge is built on a really extraordinary collaboration. This wasn't just a former fighter casually recounting tales.
No, not at all. It was a rigorous partnership between a Kenyan general and an American scholar who was dedicated to capturing that truth.
Tell us about the two men behind this account. Who was Karari Njama?
Karari Njama was truly unique among the field commanders. He was a former teacher, a general in the KLFA, who had the crucial advantage of being able to speak, read, and write English.
Which would have been rare.
Very rare for a forest fighter. He was introduced to Barnett by a scout who insisted Njama held critical inside knowledge of the war against Njeritha, the British.
And he came to trust Barnett.
He did. Njama came to see Barnett as someone genuinely supportive of African freedom, someone who hated the selfish settlers and was, in his own words, the complete opposite of the cruel colonial Wazungu. And that foundation of trust was just. It was everything.
The collaboration sounds intense. The source says they worked night and day. But I have to ask, Karari Njama was a KLFA general, someone the colonial authorities had been hunting for years. Now he's working with an American anthropologist in this newly released environment. Wasn't there a massive risk of betrayal? Or at least a deep suspicion about Barnett's true motivations?
And that's really the critical question for any insider history, isn't it? But Njama was highly educated and politically astute. He'd seen the best and the worst of both sides. He felt this intense urgency to document history before it was lost, or, fully distorted by the colonial version, which was already in print.
So he saw an opportunity.
A vital one. He described joining the Barnett family and working night and day, almost as we used to work in the forest as warriors during the war, but this time with paper and tape recorders in a warmer, drier place. He realized Barnett was the best path to ensure his side of the story, the true story of the masses, was heard internationally. That's what solidified his trust.
This intense engagement and detailed assessment of the period are what make Njama such a powerful and reliable narrator. The source material points to several specific qualities that really bolster his credibility.
It does. First, he is noted for having what the sources describe as a photographic memory and just an intimate knowledge of the terrain. He had the kind of recall that was perhaps exceptional in societies that had long relied on verbal transmission.
Right.
It was reinforced by the Kikuyu custom of constantly updating friends and relatives on significant life events. His recall of complex roots, dates, names, it provided a framework of verifiable detail.
And crucially, his narrative transcends personal glorification. He understood that his purpose was to represent the movement, not just himself.
Exactly. Second, and this is arguably more important for historical reliability, he transcended egotism. He clearly understood that my story is our story, recognizing the collective, massive nature of the struggle. He wanted to ensure the story had more than one hero.
He's focused on the system, the ideology, the army as a whole.
Yes, not just his personal achievements.
And the book structure itself seems to mirror this duality. It notes the two voices present in the final published work.
That's right. It's an unusual but highly effective style. Njama is the chief narrator, providing the actual events, the episodes of the war, in a clear, linear fashion. And then Barnett, the anthropologist, serves as the voiceover-cum-commentator discussant.
So Barnett provides the context.
Unnecessary political and anthropological context, yeah. He fills the gaps, and he threads these highly specific episodes into a smooth, cohesive, and academically rigorous narrative. It allows you, the reader, to experience the story firsthand through Njama's eyes while still getting the broader analysis from Barnett.
And we can't understand the revolution without starting with the driving force, which is reflected so vividly in Njama's own life. I mean, this wasn't theoretical for him. It was deeply personal. It started with land.
Absolutely. The trauma began early. Njama's family lost the better part of its land in 1910 when it was alienated and included in the forest reserve.
So this wasn't some abstract government policy for him.
No, this was his history, his ancestral connection. He was driven by the same acute shortage of land that moved so many others. He literally had to look toward the Aberdare forest and see Karari's Hill, named after his own grandfather, land that was now only enjoyed by wild game. That's a powerful motivator.
He also experienced the brutal hypocrisy of the system firsthand, right?
Yeah.
He grew up as a squatter's child on a European farm in the White Highlands.
That's right. And life there was initially better, but the colonial restrictions, especially on how much livestock they could own and how much land they could cultivate, eventually drove his family back to the increasingly crowded reserve.
So he saw both sides of it.
He did. And that forced transition from squatter status to landless peasant, coupled with the systemic colonial discrimination known as the color bar, that's what cemented his revolutionary motivation. The color bar was this pervasive system of racial segregation and legal discrimination.
And it applied to everything.
Everything, not just public services, but all economic opportunity.
How exactly did the color bar manifest in Njama's daily life? We tend to think of it in terms of, signs on a door. But the sources show it went so much deeper.
It was suffocating. His formal education was cut short, not by choice, but by financial necessity that was imposed by the system. His freedom was severely curtailed. His wages were miserably low. I mean, far, far below those of any European in a comparable position. And his pride was constantly trampled and degraded by this color bar.
So when he heard Jomo Kenyatta speak...
Right. When he heard Kenyatta speak at a rally in 1952 about the injustices of the stolen land and the color bar, he didn't just nod along. He found proof of his own deepest grievances in his own personal experience. He had lived the revolution before he even joined it.
So if the movement is the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, the order of those words is crucial. Land came first. Let's deepen this discussion on the central role of land, because this wasn't just about economic territory. It was about ancestry, history, and a profound cultural loss. It felt like a spiritual violation.
The Kikuyu felt a deep historical and even religious claim to the alienated land. Njama's personal anecdote illustrates the magnitude of the betrayal perfectly. He recounted his grandfather's story.
The story about the first European.
Yes, his grandfather had actually saved the life of the very first European to arrive on his ridge. He welcomed him as a visitor, but those who came later brought what they called magic fires, guns that conquered the people, killed their warriors, and then took most of the best fertile lands.
So that initial act of peace was met with violence and seizure, and that creates a legacy of profound resentment.
Absolutely. And the result was that by the time of the emergency, nearly half of the Kikuyu people were either squatters or completely landless. The KLFA wasn't fighting for vague political promises. They fought explicitly to recover this lost inheritance, what they saw as the birthright of Gikuyu and Mumbi, the foundational ancestors of their people.
And the economic reality behind this land theft is made even starker when you quantify it. The sources detail the wage inequality in the early 1950s. This isn't just theory. It's a stark accounting of exploitation.
The disparity is just jaw-dropping, and it reviews the structural foundation of the revolt. African wage earners, a massive population numbering about 120,000 workers, earned on average only $73 per worker per year.
$73 a year.
Per year. And that total included their estimated food and housing allowances, meaning their actual cash income was even lower. It was essentially a subsistence wage designed to keep them dependent.
And when you compare that to the income of the ruling minority, the European settler population, you realize the scale of the system they were rebelling against.
It's a different world. European wage earners, a small and powerful group of only 11,500 people, garnered an average total wage of $1,739 per worker per year.
So a European worker earned almost 24 times what an African worker earned.
That's right. And this massive economic gulf defined the life circumstances of the African majority, and it was compounded by the cost of living that colonial rule imposed.
And the sources translate these cold numbers directly into human misery, right? Especially in the cities.
Yes. The sheer desperation led to thousands of landless, unemployed peasants drifting into Nairobi. They were forced into squalor and degradation, sleeping 12 or 16 to a room in overcrowded urban slums like Kariokor or Pumwani. This concentration of shared poverty and shared grievance was, a volatile mixture.
And ironically, the economic policies of the colonial government inadvertently fostered the perfect conditions for a unified revolt. They created what the sources call the leveling effect. Now, this sounds counterintuitive. How did oppression lead to unification?
It's a fascinating insight into political organization. Colonial policy had a few unintended consequences. Firstly, they heavily restricted African cultivation of high-value cash crops. This prevented the emergence of a wealthy, stratified African landowning class who might have been willing to collaborate with the British to protect their own property.
So if you can't get rich, you can't distance yourself from your impoverished neighbor.
Precisely. Secondly, they retained traditional land tenure in the reserves, which further discouraged internal stratification. The result was that the Kikuyu peasantry developed as a relatively homogeneous and impoverished mass.
So they lacked the severe economic and social divisions you might see elsewhere.
Exactly, and that created a wide base of common interests.
So the colonial system was so universally oppressive that it gave them a unified political platform. Land, freedom, and dignity for everyone.
Exactly. This unity, when coupled with the intensifying struggle for scarce, fertile land against this economically and politically dominant white settler elite, it just greatly increased the probability of unified political action. The leveling effect was a critical factor in creating the mass movement that emerged.
And this unified political consciousness had deep roots. It didn't just spring up spontaneously in 1952. The ground was prepared decades earlier.
Oh, for sure. Political awareness had been fostered by earlier organizations like the banned Kikuyu Central Association, or KCA, going all the way back to the 1920s. The KCA operated within the Kenya African Union and the burgeoning trade union movement, and they were utilizing oaths as early as 1926 to guarantee the allegiance of its members.
And we also see the significant influence of independent church school movements.
Yes, and these schools were doing more than just teaching reading and writing. They were openly reflecting the growing anti-European sentiment.
They were direct competitors to the missionary schools.
Right, which were viewed as agents of colonial control. By standing opposed to interference by white missionaries in cultural life, these independent institutions became incubators for political thought and self-determination. They primed a whole generation for the eventual uprising.
Before we delve into the structure and mechanics of the KLFA, we have to address the label the British gave the movement, Mau Mau. It's a term loaded with historical baggage, and the sources show there were multiple, often conflicting explanations for where this term even came from.
The colonial administration seized on it because it helped them dehumanize the resistance, but its origin is genuinely murky. The term has no accepted literal meaning in either Kikuyu or Swahili. One theory was that it derived from a transposed phrase, uma, out, referring to the desire for Europeans to leave.
And Njama himself, the insider, suggested the movement tried to retrofit a political meaning to the phrase after the fact.
They did. That meaning was an acronym. Mzungu arudi Uingereza, Moflafika apate uhuru. Let the European return to England and the African obtain his freedom. This shows the activists recognizing that the term had gained currency and then attempting to graft a clear political objective onto it.
But the most plausible origin seems rooted in local culture, specifically in a localized kind of derogatory colloquialism.
That's right. The most credible theory links it to a Kikuyu colloquialism meaning greedy eating. It referred to the Kiama Kiamau, or Council of Greedy Eaters, elders who were more interested in securing fines, which were often goats or lambs for feasting, than in dispensing legitimate justice.
So they would just magnify a case to get a bigger fine and a better feast.
Exactly. The sources suggest that the man who first used the term to the British during the Naivasha trial was referring to the oath administrators as bad elders who just wanted the initiation fee and the feast of a goat that came with it.
So the British took a local insult tied to petty corruption and magnified it into this terrifying, meaningless epithet for the entire revolution.
Exactly. Regardless of its true root, the British seized on the term. They ensured the movement was framed by a label that suggested savagery, barbarism, and a lack of coherent political goals. It successfully distracted from the very clear, legitimate aims contained in Kenyaland and Freedom Army. It was a propaganda victory for the colonial regime from the very start.
That transition from being a landless peasant to becoming a soldier in the KLFA was marked by the Oath of Unity. This mechanism of total commitment wasn't merely a political contract, it was a deeply sacred initiation.
It was. It blended traditional Kikuyu ceremonies with the demands of a modern revolution. It was an incredibly powerful tool, a continuation of oaths which had long been important sanctions in traditional Kikuyu society.
But intensified for this new struggle.
Yes, operating as an underground movement, the oath was altered and intensified to meet the twin requirements of strict secrecy and total commitment. It used features of traditional initiation and judicial curses. The goal was to be absolutely binding, promising divine sanction or the threat of severe physical punishment, even death to anyone who violated it.
And the practical necessity of maintaining security in a prescribed organization meant that the recruitment process itself often involved an element of, well, unavoidable coercion.
It was a security imperative. Since the society was banned, it was necessary to ensure that non-members gained no prior knowledge. This underlaid the deception normally employed. Prospective members would be invited to a feast or a party, which then turned out to be an oathing ceremony.
So once you were there, you knew too much to just walk away.
Exactly. Once you were present and possessed the necessary knowledge about the organization, you faced the stark alternative of taking the oath or suffering the unhappy consequences, which included the very real threat of execution. The secrecy protected the entire organization.
Let's delve into the specific details of the ritual, because the sheer power of the commitment rests on these vivid, symbolic actions drawn straight from Kikuyu tradition. What elements were intended to bind the person body and soul?
The components were chosen specifically to appeal to deeply held traditional beliefs regarding curses and loyalty. After a goat was slaughtered, which was the traditional centerpiece of many rituals, specific parts were used, initiates were required to lick each other's blood from their middle fingers.
Symbolizing a shared, irreversible fate.
Precisely. The ceremony also used the goat's eyes, representing vision and knowledge, and then mata bone, a bone that joins the head and spinal column and contains 7 holes.
The number 7 appears repeatedly in the ritual. That's significant in many belief systems. What was its role here?
It carries immense symbolic weight in Kikuyu tradition. It often represents completion, totality, sacredness. Initiates had to pass through an arch made of the goat intestines 7 times. During this passage, the oath administrator would cut off a piece of small intestine, repeating a curse. Tatu, ugo tuika ugo unjaria maheni, muma uroria muriama.
Which means?
/ may you be cut like this. Let the oath kill he who lies. This visceral act was meant to permanently imprint the consequence of betrayal.
So they weren't just swearing an oath. They were inviting a supernatural curse upon themselves if they failed.
That's it exactly. Later, they would use 7 sodom apples and 7 kiabel thorns, pricking the goat's eyes 7 times while repeating the 21 vows. The intention was to blend the secular political demands with the most profound spiritual sanctions available in their culture.
And the vows themselves are the clearest articulation of the KLFA's revolutionary vision. They reveal that the movement's goals were comprehensive, political, economic, and deeply cultural.
The sources list 21 detailed vows, and while some were obvious political demands, like always helping fellow members, obeying strike calls, never retreating, many targeted specific colonial injustices, initiates vowed to never sell land to a European or Asian and explicitly rejected the colonial color bar. These were oaths of economic solidarity.
But the cultural vows are equally revealing. They seem to be specifically targeting the interference of European missionaries and the colonial government into their social life.
Absolutely. Two vows really stand out in this regard. Initiates vowed to never allow a daughter to remain uncircumcised. This was an explicit rejection of European missionary attempts to force the abandonment of what the Kikuyu viewed as a sacred cultural practice. To swear this was to swear allegiance to their own traditions against that foreign influence.
And the second cultural pillar they attacked was the colonial education system.
Yes. They vowed to reject the colonial education policy known as the Beecher Report. This report, highly controversial at the time, was seen as a way for the British government to force Africans into a specific, subservient, educational, track technical, and primary training designed to produce just enough clerks and farm supervisors, but crucially, not enough intellectual or political leaders.
So to swear against the Beecher Report was a powerful rejection of a controlled destiny.
It was an assertion of the right to self-directed knowledge, and the very last vow pledged allegiance to the imprisoned leaders. I shall always follow the leadership of Jomo Kenyatta and Mbiu Koinonge.
With the ideology and membership cemented by the oath, the movement transitioned to armed conflict after 1952. They established the Forest War Machine, primarily based in the vast, cold Aberdare Mountains. This required massive mobilization and meticulous organization to survive.
The mobilization was astonishing. Nair district played a critical role. It was often viewed as the spear or brawn of the tribe, traditionally the most militant area. It contributed 40 to 50% of the estimated 15,000 fighters who were operating in the Aberdares by mid-1953.
And they formed these large camps.
They did. They coalesced into large, permanent camp clusters, with Kigumo Camp being cited as an excellent example and a model for other sections.
Life inside the camp, especially given the cold, wet conditions of the forest, sounds incredibly harsh and strictly controlled.
Survival was the main priority. Rules mandated that everyone wake up before dawn to say their morning prayers. To evade detection, all personal belongings, clothes, cups, spoons had to be hidden immediately, ready to be grabbed in case of an enemy attack.
But discipline sometimes revealed existing social hierarchies, right?
It did. The sources note that leaders were often better fed, sometimes receiving hot roasted meat and soup for breakfast, while the rank and file often received only one insufficient meal a day.
Despite the lack of material resources, the intellectual rigor they applied to the war effort is striking, especially in their use of specialized coded terminology to maintain operational security.
They created an entire lexicon to confuse captured documents and to instill discipline and morale. An airplane was kariguri, meaning it is up. Hongars, the Kikuyu who collaborated with the British, were initially armed with spears and were demeaned as gatimu, small spear, or gathishi, sharp instrument.
And what about the government military?
They were referred to as ikakuri, or heavy pitchfork, suggesting they were a cumbersome, powerful tool wielded by others.
And their ideology was reinforced daily through a spiritual practice that consciously rejected the institutionalized Christianity they associated with their oppressors.
The spiritual center of the movement was clear. Mount Kenya, Ngai's traditional home. The warriors would face the mountain for their daily prayers, powerful affirmations of their moral superiority and divine mandate. They prayed directly to Ngai, often holding soil in their hands, reciting, "We have no weapons to fight against these people, but we believe that thy sword will defeat our enemies."
This is a clear assertion that their fight for land was sanctioned by a higher power that transcended the European Church.
Precisely. They continued, "We believe that you did not create us so that we might become servants of other people in the lands you blessed to our father Gikuyu and Mumbi." While the ideology sometimes contained, syncretic elements of Old Testament Christianity interwoven with Kikuyu beliefs, institutionalized Christianity was viewed as just another aspect of European domination. Their spiritual practice directly supported their central claim. The land belonged to them by divine right.
As the movement gained strength, the leaders began to look toward the future political reality. They established a cohesive national structure, the Kenya Parliament, or KP, in an attempt to overcome the decentralized territorial loyalties that were traditional to the Kikuyu people.
The formation of the KP in 1954 was a critical move. It was spurred by the realization that they lacked a central organization above the locational level that could coordinate policy and military action. And the vision was grand.
What was the vision?
To establish the African government, run by uneducated warriors and non-Darua, until the big stars, Kenyatta, and other released political leaders could take over upon independence. The founders of the KP clearly intended their names to live as long as the Kenya African government shall live.
This vision demanded bureaucracy, even in the unforgiving environment of the Aberdare forest. That's why Dadan Kimathi mandated incredibly rigorous record-keeping. It wasn't just administrative, it was an act of preserving a political legacy.
Kimathi understood that the revolution needed documentation to be legitimate in the eyes of history and the future independent government. The system was astonishingly sophisticated for a guerrilla movement. Clerks were required to keep 10 different types of books, and crucially, this included the individual loss account.
The individual loss account.
Yes, which had 20 columns tracking every conceivable loss suffered by supporters: money, livestock, crops, houses damaged by the enemy, everything.
That level of forensic detail tells you everything about their political planning.
Mhm.
They fully intended to compensate their supporters and use this documentation as irrefutable proof of colonial atrocities.
Exactly. It was a forward-looking accounting system designed for restitution. They also kept a civilian death record book, meticulously recording the names of all non-fighters who died during the emergency, whether it was due to starvation in the villages, disease, or the enemy's violence. They intended to memorialize every casualty.
And to protect these vital documents, they incorporated operational security right into the bureaucracy itself.
They were highly conscious of counterintelligence. Clerks were explicitly warned to be careful when recording battle history, especially in cases where collaborators were murdered. They were instructed never to record the real names of the warriors concerned.
So they had to use code.
Exactly. They had to use unknown nicknames or to create new names or letters for substitution, which only the clerk can understand. The objective was absolute. If the government ever captured these books, there should be no evidence whatsoever for convincing any of the warriors. It shows the movement operated with a high degree of organizational intelligence.
However, the British were far from idle. While the KLFA was building its parliament, the British counter-strategy went into full effect in 1954. The crackdown was massive, calculated, and aimed directly at isolating the KLFA from its civilian supply base.
This was the turning point. Operation Anvil was the primary strategy to neutralize the urban core, which served as the logistical backbone, providing money and arms. It started on April 24, 1954, involving 25,000 soldiers and police.
The scale is just staggering.
It is. The entire African population of Nairobi, some 100,000 people, were rounded up. Of these, 70,000 Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru were screened, and nearly 50,000 young men of warrior age were detained in concentration camps.
That one operation instantly crippled the supply chain of the entire movement.
It was devastating. It immediately disrupted organized resistance in Nairobi and significantly curtailed the flow of arms, ammunition, medical supplies, clothing, and money into the Aberdares. The city was the heart of the supply, and it was surgically removed.
And at the same time, the colonial government accelerated the villagization program in the reserve. This was a strategy they borrowed from fighting guerrillas in Malaya, right?
It was demographic warfare. Over 1 million Kikuyu were forcibly resettled into over 800 new prison-like villages built near home guard and police posts. These villages were enforced by strict dusk-to-dawn curfews and communal forced labor, often performed under guard, which effectively turned the civilian population into hostages.
And the result was predictable: widespread suffering and a humanitarian disaster.
The congestion, combined with the inability of people to tend their fields outside the curfew zones, led to widespread hunger, malnutrition, and disease. And the sources indicate this was not just a side effect, but a deliberate strategy. Isolate the fighters by making their civilian base pay a catastrophic price for their loyalty.
And to complete the physical isolation, they employed the trench.
Yes. A 50-mile barbed wire fenced mine trench was dug along the forest fringe to prevent even the most determined civilians from passing supplies to the fighters. With the British employing over 50,000 men against the estimated 15,000 guerrillas, the government was simply trying to starve the fighters out, knowing that direct head-on conflict in the forest was generally ineffective.
This immense military and psychological pressure immediately exposed the structural weaknesses of the Kenya parliament, particularly what the sources called the vertical loyalties to individual leaders rather than to the central political organization.
The internal divisions became catastrophic under duress. The feud between Dedan Kimathi and Stanley Mathinge, the two top leaders, was deeply damaging to the KP's authority. Mathinge, for instance, openly suspected Kimathi of attempting to kill him after a bullet exploded in a fire they were warming around.
He thought Kimathi planted it.
He believed Kimathi sought to eliminate him to gain sole leadership.
And this wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a total breakdown of trust at the highest level.
It was terminal. Despite Kimathi suggesting they take an oath binding them as brothers to never kill or undermine each other, Mathin refused to attend Kimathi's meetings. He effectively undermined the KP's central authority and shattered any unified command structure. When the pressure was highest, the organization fragmented based on personal allegiance.
This political fracturing was then exacerbated by a profound class cleavage, rooted in the level of education among the leaders, a split between the educated political thinkers and the illiterate peasant warriors.
This is a critical insight into the political failure. Leaders like Kahiutina explicitly rejected the authority of the Kenya parliament, arguing that education and illiteracy could not work together. He claimed educated people were somehow Europeanized because they had abandoned traditional customs and were affiliated with mission religion.
So he sounds like he feared that the educated class would simply replace the British colonial administration and just perpetuate the class hierarchy.
That was precisely his fear. Kahiutina asserted that the illiterate majority should lead the new government and hold all high positions. He viewed the educated members of the KP as merely stone walls which protected the educated members to carry on their plans. This internal ideological conflict meant that the KLFA, even if they had achieved a military victory, was already politically divided on who had the legitimate right to govern the new Kenya.
As supplies dwindled and internal trust evaporated, the high moral authority the KLFA had fought so hard to build collapsed entirely, leading to actions that alienated their own civilian base.
Discipline deteriorated rapidly because of the scarcity of food. Despite leadership efforts to enforce military justice, incidents occurred where warriors, driven by hunger, robbed the homes of their own civilian sympathizers, causing those very villagers to turn away and lose faith.
The situation became so desperate that leaders themselves started cutting corners on justice. The source notes an incredibly stark incident where Kimathi himself executed a prisoner just to save time.
He took the law entirely into his own hands. It was an act of desperation and exhaustion. In a case involving an accused Camarera leader, he heard the case within 5 minutes, took his pistol, and summarily executed the prisoner. He claimed he had saved us a day or two of hearing Joseph's case.
And then he ordered the dead man to.
He ordered him to lead the 21 dead Itungari who had died in his imbushi. These actions, the personal killing, the dictatorial behavior, increased internal hatred and enmity within the ranks, speeding the collapse of morale.
The ruthless nature of the conflict is tragically highlighted by the Kaiawe massacre. This single event must have absolutely demoralized the fighters, proving that the British would give no quarter.
It was a catastrophic moment in Fort Hall. A group of 92 inexperienced Nairobi recruits were ambushed by government forces. Seeing themselves completely surrounded, they raised their hands and surrendered.
They surrendered.
And they were then systematically told to put down all their possessions, take off their clothes, and were shot in cold blood by the security forces. This grim reality that surrender meant certain death, even when you were unarmed, showed the fighters the total dehumanization they faced.
So, unable to defeat them militarily inside the forest, the government learned to exploit the deepest human element, the fighters' loyalty to their families, as the ultimate weakness.
The government realized that the fighters' love sympathy was the greatest weakness to the revolution loyalties. They exploited this with a sophisticated psychological strategy. They used captured leaders like General China and women from the reserves, wives and mothers, to try and trick or appeal to fighters to surrender.
They would send the women into the forest.
Yes, to meet their fighting relatives. And the emotional stakes of those meetings must have been just unbearable.
I can't even imagine.
The women always shed tears whenever our fighters rejected the surrender offer, forcing the hardened warriors to confront the reality of the starvation and misery their families were enduring in the villages. The leaders knew that if a warrior cast his eyes to his family and wealth, his love and mercy would be drawn to them and he would forget the fight. This strategy, leveraging family bonds against political loyalty, proved devastatingly effective.
Despite the immense sacrifices, and despite Kenya achieving independence in 1963, the aftermath proved to be a profound and systemic betrayal of the veterans' cause. This is documented heartbreakingly in the source material.
The militants who survived the war and the detention camps returned to a depressingly alien world. They found they were still mostly landless, their property had been confiscated or stolen, and their traditions had been trampled by the relentless social engineering of the emergency. They returned to essentially the same impoverished circumstances they had battled so hard against.
And the new leaders, many of whom had been moderates or had opposed the armed struggle, immediately sought to appease the white settlers whose land was the very root of the conflict.
Jomo Kenyatta, the eventual post-independence leader, caved in to white settler pressure. He implemented a policy where privileged Kenyans could buy land from the same settler class who had enriched themselves from stolen lands, rather than simply returning the alienated land to the landless peasants.
He told citizens to forgive and forget the Mau Mau.
He did. He effectively sidelined the true heroes of the armed struggle in favor of establishing a politically stable, moderate government that would be acceptable to the departing colonial powers.
And the economic betrayal was cemented by foreign financial entanglement.
Absolutely. Britain forced Kenya to accept loans to compensate or buy out the white settlers at exorbitant market prices. This guaranteed that the newly independent state began life burdened by debt, ensuring the wealth accrued from stolen land remained with the departing Europeans, instead of being used to uplift the landless masses.
So the ultimate result was the rise of a new indigenous elite who privatized the state's resources and power.
The sources describe how collaborators and those who played a moderate role deceitfully grabbed power, forming cartels for the explicit purpose of denying former freedom fighters jobs, land, education, and business opportunities. The betrayal was complete.
And this isn't ancient history.
Not at all. The Mau Mau Veterans Association, in a 2020 statement cited in the source material, confirms that its members still live in extreme poverty, extreme lack of education, and extreme lack of settlement decades later.
The final, painful symbol of this systematic betrayal remains Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi himself, the most renowned leader of the KLFA.
Kimathi was captured and executed in 1957 following what the sources call a kangaroo trial. His remains still lie in an unmarked grave on the grounds of the notorious Kamiti maximum security prison where he was buried. This denial of an honorable burial, decades after independence, is a chilling and potent symbol of how the post-independence government sought to erase the moral victory and revolutionary spirit of the armed struggle.
So what does this all mean when we connect the threads? The account from Karari Njama shows the KLFA was a nationwide mass movement with clear, uncompromising demands for land and freedom. They successfully shook colonial power to its core. They forced the British hand and accelerated the path to independence.
But the profound tragedy that Mau from Within documents is how, despite their overwhelming success in the military struggle, they failed the subsequent political transition. Internal fracturing, combined with the successful, brutal British counter-strategy of isolation and starvation, allowed a moderate, self-serving indigenous class to step into the power vacuum and inherit the colonial state apparatus essentially intact.
The source material suggests that the post-independence government destroyed the essential connection between the idea of being Kenyan and the idea of freedom. That powerful link, forged in the forest and sealed with blood, was broken when the veterans were marginalized and the collaborators took control.
They won the war but lost the peace. They allowed what the sources describe as a self-serving class to grab and privatize the apparatus of the young state, ultimately replacing the white oppressors with the black elite who were equally committed to maintaining the existing wealth disparities.
This raises an important and provocative question for you, the listener, to consider. What happens when a revolutionary movement successfully wins its military war against an imperial enemy, but immediately loses the moral and political battle for the future, allowing a self-serving class to privatize the state apparatus? The cost of that political failure, as the continuing pleas of the veterans show, is still being paid today, decades later, by the masses who risked everything to recover their land and their freedom.